The Gospel called Mark has no Christmas stories. No account of the birth and infancy of Jesus. Why? The Gospel called Mark likewise never mentions Joseph, the father of Jesus. Why? Joseph is not mentioned in any document originating before 70 Common Era. Paul doesn't know Joseph. And Joseph is missing in the Gospel called Mark. In the New Testament documents originating after 70 Common Era, reference is made to Joseph, to his righteousness, to his Davidic ancestry, to his dream and the angel's conversation with him, to his holy marriage to the socially perceived impure Mary, to his trip into Egypt with his family, and to his trip to the temple with Mary and Jesus. Context group scholar Andries van Aard asks, did later evangelists invent Joseph, drawing from the well-known and highly reverenced ethical example of the Joseph found in the book of Genesis, a great Israelite hero later enhanced by Hellenistic Semitic literature? Could this biblical Joseph have served as the model for the transmitters of the early Jesus tradition? Van Aard argues convincingly it did. Did these third-wave Jesus group writers, like Matthew, invent the New Testament Joseph based on this ancient Israelite hero? The anonymous authors of the Gospels called Matthew, Luke, and John were Hellenized Israelites, all who knew well the Israelite Joseph tradition. They found themselves, like other Jesus group people living from 70 to 135 Common Era, involved in heated controversies with fellow Israelites about Jesus' illegitimacy. Could they have counteracted the position widely held by enemies to the Jesus group that Jesus was a bastard by positioning Jesus to be the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob? Look at how the Gospel called Mark begins. No Annunciation, no angels, no Joseph, no Bethlehem. Instead, we start off with the adult Jesus being baptized, where he is declared son. Right off the bat in the Gospel called Mark, Jesus is declared legitimate by God. Who's going to refute that? Why no Christmas stories in Mark? Simple. They hadn't been invented yet. Whether Joseph historically existed or not, the historical Jesus probably grew up without a father playing a significant role in his life. His fellow peasants imagined Jesus to be a bastard. No one in the Galilee would hail Mary as a holy woman. Van Aard argues that Jesus was baptized and joined John the Baptist's political religious movement probably to deal with some perceived sinful sickness Jesus had, namely his lowly social status, his condition as bastard, and that needed to be addressed and healed. The closest thing to Christmas stories we get in Mark is Jesus' baptism. Why would the historical Jesus want to be dunked by John the prophet, who, by the way, wasn't historically related to Jesus? Luke makes that detail up later. Whether or not there was a historical Joseph, if the historical Jesus was perceived to be a fatherless child, this unfortunate relationship with his family might provide us with probable clues. Moreover, Jesus' troubling and shameful origins may provide insight about his relationship with his family and his fellow peasant villagers in Nazareth. What could it reveal about his vision of God as Father or Mediterranean patron? Or his vision notably of children and of other so-called nothing people from his society? Given this backdrop, an altogether different portrait of Jesus' initial activity emerges. Imagine the peasant Jesus suffering the sin of being a bastard. Remember that sin in the Bible is not the later theologically evolved understanding of sin many Christians have today. Sin in the Bible is the act that shames or dishonors God. To be a bastard and be an Israelite is to be the living embodiment of sin, of shame, of dishonor to God. He moves away from his home village, trapped in a strained relationship with relatives who are burdened by his existence as shameful bastard and embarrassment. There, in alternate reality, Jesus experiences healing and commissioning in a homecoming into God's kingdom. Through his altered state of consciousness experienced at his baptism, Jesus probably encountered the reality created by the Spirit of God, which developed his perception of the care of a sky vault patron who accepted him as beloved. And the historical Jesus, now commissioned shamanic healer, both attested to and lived out this reality. Through the stories of associates and later writings of their followers, Jesus became the icon of God's forgiveness of sin and providential care. Saint Joseph is highly misunderstood by many Catholics and other Christians. How can we see Joseph better? Meaning, in an historically and culturally plausible way. I challenge you to take the following quiz on Joseph. It will help you better understand him, Jesus, and the Gospels. 1. Before Joseph lived with Mary, what was their probable relationship? A. Childhood sweethearts. B. Best friends. C. Both A and B. D. Patrilateral first cousins. 2. When did Joseph and Mary get engaged? A. Following a great amount of prayer. B. After Mary had spent much time in the temple. C. They never were engaged. D. After they fell in love. 3. Which of the following best describes the union of Mary and Joseph? A. A religious union called marriage. B. A civil union called marriage. C. A covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. D. The union or the pooling of honor of two Middle Eastern families whereby the two spouses represent the kinship groups. 4. In biblical marriage, God's will means A. That the spouses, a man and a woman, freely choose not under constraint. B. That the consent between the spouses is an indispensable element that makes the marriage. C. Both A and B. D. That the fathers and mothers of bride and groom do the choosing. 5. When, according to the Matthean infancy narrative, Joseph discovers that Mary is pregnant, initially he is A. Overwhelmed and feels unworthy to play a role with the Holy Mother and Holy Child. B. Humiliated as a cuckold, probably the last person in the village to find out about Mary's pregnancy. C. Grateful to the God of Israel. D. None of the above. 6. Who were the first villagers to discover Mary's pregnancy? A. The women, who are the intelligentsia of the Middle Eastern village. B. Joseph, when the angel of the Lord told him. C. Mary's best friend, Joanna. D. Mary's dad, Joachim. 7. How did people find out that Mary was pregnant before living with Joseph? A. The angel of the Lord told them. B. They just knew it had to be a miracle. C. Either when Mary didn't show up at the only village bath at the time each month when the women gathered to cleanse, or when she did show up, tried to hide it but couldn't. D. When Mary went around the village with a tambourine, singing praises to God because she was pregnant. 8. Matthew informs his readers that Joseph was a righteous man. This means that he A. was a morally upstanding person. B. was an Israelite holy man, what anthropologists would call a shaman, someone who can talk with spirits in alternate reality. C. hardly ever did anything to be guilty about. D. someone who prayed a lot. 9. Righteous men like Joseph always want to please God. In Matthew, when Joseph learns of Mary's pregnancy, he does not want to accept the child because A. Joseph knows that the child cannot be his, and to accept the child would therefore make Joseph a thief, something that would displease God. B. He feels radically unworthy before the Holy Mother and Holy Child. C. He feels confused and betrayed. D. None of the above. 10. Because in Matthew, Joseph knows that Mary is pregnant already, that means A. God must have done this. B. The devil must have done this. C. Some other human male must have done this. D. There is no way to consummate the marriage, and therefore no way to show the blood-stained sheet to the village at the wedding feast. This will lead to shame and death. 11. How do Mediterranean people like Joseph solve seemingly impossible dilemmas and crises? A. Just like Americans do, with intelligence and hard work. B. Getting advice from family members and friends. C. Through an alternate state of consciousness experience. D. By talking with a priest. 12. When Joseph took Mary into his house, that means that A. They lied to everyone at the wedding celebration by faking the blood-stained sheet. B. They told everyone that it's okay that Mary was pregnant early because it was God's will. C. They eloped, skipped town, and hid out in a nearby village until things blew over. D. They paid off everyone to keep their mouths shut. 13. How do you imagine Joseph acting as father to Jesus? A. Joseph was a warm and kind-hearted daddy. B. A hard-working but quiet provider for Mary and Jesus. C. Both A and B. D. Like a Middle Eastern North African father, someone mostly absent from a boy's early life. 14. Thinking about Joseph and Mary, what is the strongest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 15. And what is the weakest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 16. How do you think Mary would have fared in Joseph's father's home, the patriarchal compound? A. Always suspect and never truly fitting in. B. Loved and cherished as one of the family. C. Reverenced as the Holy Mother of God. D. They didn't live with Joseph's father. The Holy Family was a nuclear family, just like Americans imagine. 17. In the biblical or Mediterranean world, all women in the patriarchal compound do what to their prepubescent sons? A. Teach them to read the Bible and pray. B. Let them play wherever they want. C. Treat them equally with the village girls. D. Spoil them rotten, doting on them and keeping them pampered, pleasured, embraced, and drowned in warmth. 18. Because of their fiercely gender-divided world, with father and all-male role models absent, when men of prepubescent males like Jesus grow up, they necessarily are haunted their entire lives by A longing for their fathers. B, a sense of deep compassion given them by their mothers and sisters. C, gender ambiguity. D, a deeper commitment to religion. 19. Because they are forever haunted by the correct answer to the last question, Middle Eastern North African males compensate for this by means of A, constantly proving their manhood through Middle Eastern North African hyper-ethnomasculinity. B, trusting in God. C, listening to the advice mother gives. D, none of the above. 20. Depending on how long he lived past Jesus' puberty, how would Joseph have probably raised the teenage Jesus? A, with deep prayer and teaching him to be a carpenter by trade. B, like any great daddy would. C, both A and B. D, by severe physical beatings, conditioning Jesus to withstand any punishment without complaining. 21. Say, as an American Christian, I treat the Bible like a manual on how to raise sons or daughters in our American setting. I follow it closely and act out its prescriptions. What probably will be the result? A, psychopathology and prison time. B, holy children who fear the Lord. C, the salvation of America. D, both B and C. 22. What was Joseph's profession? A, carpenter. B, teacher. C, peasant village artisan. D, none of the above. 23. Given Joseph's work, he and his family were A, middle class. B, wealthy. C, poor. D, extremely poor. 24. Joseph had to travel to find work. This meant he was viewed by others as A, a righteous man who works hard for his family. B, a social deviant. C, someone famous throughout Galilee. D, someone with connections. Well, that's it. How do you think you did? To find out, look below in the description for a link to a Patheos blog to find the right answers and gauge how well you know Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as they are presented in the Gospels. Enjoy! The circumstances of Jesus' conception and birth, described by the anonymous Third Wave Jesus Group author we call Matthew, take on sharper contours when viewed in their Mediterranean cultural context. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 24. The origins of Jesus, Messiah, are thus. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through a Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a Tzaddik, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her leniently. Such was his intention when, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home, for it is through a holy wind that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Look, the woman of childbearing and marriageable age shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took his wife into his home. Let's talk a bit about biblical betrothal and marriage. It would be wrong to consider betrothal as similar to our Western idea of engagement before marriage. Engagement happens between two romantic, self-selecting partners. Betrothal was the initial phase of the biblical marriage process, something radically different than the marriage we know about even in our religious traditions. In the biblical marriage process, prospective spouses, commonly patrilateral first cousins, were set apart for each other. That is betrothal. Though a betrothed couple did not live together, a formal divorce was required to break the public establishment of the betrothal. Sex with a betrothed woman was considered adultery, an act committed by a man to shame or dishonor another man. Biblical marriage, like that between Joseph and Mary, means ancient Mediterranean marriage. In the ancient Mediterranean world, marriages were arranged by mothers and fathers to join extended families and not individuals. The biblical or Mediterranean bride did not expect love. She did not expect companionship. And she did not expect comfort. In this rigidly gender-divided world, men and women had very little contact. Indeed, the weakest emotional bond from this cultural world was that between spouses, because of the arranged nature of their union. Both partners realized that their union was arranged for the political or economic advantage of their families. The entire biblical, i.e. Mediterranean marriage process was a ritualized removal of a woman from her family. The groom's father, normally the brother of the bride's father, offered gifts or services to the bride's father to win the wife he wanted for his son. The bride's father made the final decision. The women of both families, the intelligentsia of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village, negotiate the contract to make certain neither family gets shortchanged. But the patriarch of each family ratified the contract publicly. When the groom took the bride into his home, really the house compound of his father in this patrilocal arrangement, the marriage process was completed. Now, in light of all of this, let's discuss Mary's pregnancy. Consider, given the very nosy nature of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village life, where everybody's business is minding everybody else's business, and there is zero privacy, and given the separation of men from women in this extremely gender-divided cultural world, and given the fact that the betrothed couple were not yet living together, Joseph, as presented in the story, may have been among the last to learn about Mary's pregnancy. The village women, again the intelligentsia of Bethlehem, would have noticed that Mary was not participating in their obligatory monthly ritual purification. Villages like Bethlehem and Nazareth only had one bath. The anonymous author we call Matthew inserts an explanation for his readers. Mary is pregnant by a spirit, a wind, an other than human person that is holy. This is a good spirit who did this. Not a mischievous spirit, not an evil spirit, but a holy spirit. That's all well and good for the readers, but what about Joseph? Well, Joseph will have to learn this in another way. Think about Joseph's predicament. The honor code of the Mediterranean world demands that no one take what properly belongs to another. Mary's child does not belong to Joseph. It's not his. So he hesitates to take it. He also knows that he will be unable to display publicly the tokens of virginity on his wedding night. My friends, if Joseph doesn't act quickly, he will be dishonored. He will be publicly shamed as a cuckold. By law, Joseph is entitled to return Mary to her father, and expose her to death. Numbers chapter 5 describes the ordeal Mary would have to undergo. But Joseph is an honorable man and determines to divorce her leniently. There is no such thing as a quiet divorce in this cultural world. Joseph's sense of honor hopes that the rightful father will seize this opportunity to claim the child and marry Mary. In all of his decision-making, Joseph acts very honorably. And Joseph learns the will of the God of Israel. Our Mediterranean ancestors in the faith generally tried to live by the will of God. But how did God make God's will known? And how did people learn it? Elites, such as Herod, resorted to the very expensive option of consulting scripture experts. But ordinary folk, peasants like Joseph, had to rely on ordinary means. The prophet Joel reports a proverb that captures a basic Mediterranean belief. Old men dream dreams, young men see visions. Joseph dreamed dreams. So too did the astrologers. Both Joseph and the astrologers learn God's will in a dream. This is not only the ordinary way of learning God's will, but also an allusion to their age. They must be old men, because old men dream dreams. But remember, because of widespread terrible health and hygiene conditions, less than 5% of the population lived to the age of 30. God personally announces to Joseph the gender of the child. A highly prized male is a special gift of God in this culture, and God also personally assigns the child's name, Jesus. This fact immediately immerses Jesus in honor far surpassing human calculation, and further enhances Joseph's honorable reputation, for God would never honor a shameful person. In an effort to contemporize the biblical record, some modern preachers and creatives online communicating through social media like memes speak about Mary as a pregnant, unwed teenage girl and describe Jesus' family as homeless. Spiritually, we can and should find Christ today, especially in those of our human family so marginalized and trounced upon by systematic injustice. And we must fight against the horror of injustice afflicting them. Having said that, these clever descriptions are ill-suited to Mediterranean culture and are unfair to Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. While the circumstances and embarrassment of Mary's predicament look similar to American experiences, the consequences in her culture were radically different. In the Mediterranean agrarian society of the Gospel according to Luke, all the village women, mothers, aunts, sisters, etc., raised the boys and girls together, but only until the age of puberty. All families in the Bible are Mediterranean, and the strongest emotional bond in the Mediterranean family is that between mother and eldest son. This emotional bond gives the mother enormous power over her son's life, all the way through adulthood. Recall Rebekah's manipulative meddling into the lives of her adult sons, Jacob and Esau. Another consequence is that boys who approach the age of puberty are invariably spoiled. Remember, sons are the mother's social security in their old age, in this culture. Because Mediterranean boys are highly valued in this culture, all Mediterranean women pamper and pleasure them. For instance, in the Mediterranean world of the Gospels, boys are breastfed twice as long as girls, even long after he is able to speak. When he asks for food, he is immediately fed. This is his experience. Certainly, Jesus and all other Israelite boys, and all other Mediterranean boys, would inescapably conclude from this experience that his every word to women is like law. This is how it went for all circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern peoples for at least 4,000 years. A third consequence of raising boys and girls together to the nearly total exclusion of the father and other men during this nurturing process is that Mediterranean boys like Jesus enter puberty with an ambiguous identity. You see, because he had no male role model up to that point, he would not know how to be a man. At puberty, the first century Israelite boy is unceremoniously shoved out of the comfort and pleasures of the Garden of Eden, woman's world, into the harsh and hierarchical violence of the men's world. Now all the men teach the adolescent his proper place and behavior. Often, this was accomplished by brutal physical punishings and beatings, which he is taught must be suffered in silence, without retaliation, without complaint. Certainly Jesus, and all the males he knew in his life, would have experienced this. And so also he would naturally conclude, as would all the male peers of his life, that such stoic suffering is one way of demonstrating manliness. In fact, haunted by Mediterranean gender ambiguity, the Middle Eastern North African Jesus and all his male peers would inescapably strive for Mediterranean hyper-ethnomasculinity, as recalled in the Passion narratives and really throughout the Gospels. Therefore, whenever reading this gospel story found only in Luke about the 12-year-old Jesus at the temple, it is best read illuminated by this Mediterranean cultural backdrop. Why did Jesus' parents not notice that Jesus was missing until after a day's journey in the homeward direction north to Galilee? The adolescent Jesus was probably still in the severe Mediterranean process of transition into male adulthood. In the caravans, Israelites, like all Mediterranean and Middle Eastern peoples, traveled according to the gender divisions that permeated their society. Men and boys past the age of puberty traveled together. Women, girls, and prepubescent boys traveled together. By the way, did I mention the weakest emotional bond in Jesus' cultural world? That would be that between spouses. Marriages in this world are arranged, you see. And women and men, even married, live in very different worlds. Joseph probably sighed when he discovered that Jesus was absent from the company of men. Likely, he concluded that Jesus was still struggling with his transition from women's company and ran back to its Edenic comforts. In contrast, Mary may have proudly, if wistfully, believed that Jesus at last was with the men, as would be appropriate for a lad of his age. Only after a day's journey, when Jesus could not be found among male or female relatives and friends, did his family realize he was not in the caravan at all. When Americans of any stripe, Christians included, read Luke chapter 2, verse 41 to 52, so much romantic nonsense gets read into the text. Folks, we need to read these stories respectfully. And the first reading of the Gospels is Mediterranean culture. Last time we spoke about how Mary and Joseph lost their teenage son, Jesus. Now let's turn to when Jesus is finally found, according to the Gospel called Luke. Two things emerge from the Lucan report. First, the 12-year-old Jesus is meeting with an adult group of men, teachers, in the temple, and giving evidence of intelligent understanding. The author we know as Luke therefore indicates that Jesus has successfully made the transition into the adult male world. But the transition has other consequences that are evident in Jesus' dialogue with his mother, Mary. Look at Mary and how she reproaches her son. There's some personal irritation there. Son, why have you treated us like this? That's perfectly understandable. After all, isn't Jesus supposed to begin to behave like a responsible adult male? Obviously, he failed to inform Joseph, Mary, and all his friends and relatives about his intention, staying behind in the temple. In this group-oriented culture, such independent and individualistic behavior is irresponsible, disrespectful, and shameful. Please don't forget that the author we know as Luke, though he is an elite, is not an American. He's not a 21st century Western individualist. In his creating this story, he is bringing out something about the holy man Jesus. Then look at Jesus' response. You could hardly call it respectful. Did you not know? But that's equally understandable too. Something missing in the English is that the verb know Luke uses is plural. This indicates that Jesus is not only reproaching Mary, but also Joseph. Male maturity in the Mediterranean cultural world entails becoming liberated from the female control. A Mediterranean man, and that would include also Israelites like Jesus, wrestles throughout life with the tension between leaving female company behind, yet continuing to nurture the strong bond with his mother, which is, by the way, again, the strongest emotional bond in the circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultural worlds. Struggling now to trade his mother's tutelage for Joseph's, the Lucan Jesus is irritated by Mary's reproach. How do we explain Jesus' reproach to Joseph? One explanation is that he failed to keep a closer eye and stronger control over Jesus as an adolescent eager to take his rightful place in his appropriate, controlling, all-male group. Did Joseph not care enough about him? It is hard to raise children in any culture. It's never been easy. Sometimes the only thing that parents can do is to ponder the mystery and hope that the child will continue growing up into wisdom, maturity, and favor among human beings and holy and absolute mystery we call God.